In this lesson, we're going to be looking at data types. So what are data types? So recall that most programs involve storing and manipulating data. That's a key part to pretty much any program you write. And if you think back to the last lesson as well, we kind of talked about how a variable is just a little bit of space that the computer set aside to store a specific piece of information. So in a nutshell, what data types do is they tell the computer how much space to set aside to store a certain piece of information. So in Python, there's these things called primitive data types, and these really exist in pretty much any programming language, actually. So a primitive data type is they're the various basic data types that you can represent within your program. So what are these most basic types of data? Well, Python has 4 of them. The first one is a string. A string is a contiguous sequence of characters, meaning that it's a bunch of characters, and the way they're represented in your computer's memory is they all share a common border with one another. You can think of it just like the United States. Each state that makes up the US, you can think of the United States as one giant string of states, and the states are contiguous to one another. They share common borders. If you want to look at this from a programming aspect, you can see we have a variable and we assign it a string, Donald Trump. So we have our variable president and we use the equal sign to assign it the value Donald Trump. And we know this is a string because it's enclosed in quotes. That's kind of how Python identifies a string. If we look at this specific string in our computer's memory and look at how the computer actually represents it, we see it as follows. We see each character separated into each little spot for each little memory slot. And then this, of course, gets converted into binary numbers, which represent characters using ASCII, but that's not really important. But just look at the way the strings are organized in the memory. They share a border with each other. They're contiguous to one another. So that was kind of a little out of the scope of this course. We don't really want to focus on how the computer represents information. We want to just know how it works. So as far as you should be concerned, a string is really just text. The next primitive data type is a Boolean. A Boolean is either a true or a false value. For instance, we have a variable isPresident and we use the equal sign to assign it the Boolean value false. Now, important thing to note is you don't put a Boolean inside of quotes. If you do, it becomes a string. And the other thing you should note is that the capital, the first letter of the Boolean, whether it be the true or the false, is capitalized. So if it's true, the T is capitalized. If it's false, the F is capitalized. The next primitive data type is an integer. An integer is any whole number. It cannot have a fractional or decimal value, and it can be positive or negative. So integers include 42, 37, 18, 19, 20, anything like that. It can be positive or negative as long as it doesn't have a fractional or decimal value. For instance, we have our variable answer. We use the equal sign to assign it the integer 42. So again, make sure it's not inside of quotes and it doesn't have a decimal point, because if you have a decimal point, that's going to make it a new type of data type, which is this one, a float. So a float is a number that is able to have fractional or decimal values, and it can also be positive or negative. So for instance, you have pi, which would be a perfect example of a float. You have 42.0. This, although it doesn't currently have any decimal points, since you have the 0.0, that tells Python that this is a float and it's able to have fractional values, whereas if it's an integer, it's unable to have fractional values. So for instance, we have a variable pi and we just assign it the value of the first couple digits of pi. So let's take a look at some of these data types in the editor. So the first thing I want to do is I just want to create a variable representing my name. So I'm just going to create a variable called my name equals, and I'll just give it a string, Luigi Battaglioli. The next variable I want to make is a variable representing my age. So my age equals 17. From here, I want to make another variable. Let's call this money. So we can have negative 0.35. We can have another variable. We'll just call this my, we'll do is cool. And we'll set this equal to true. Oh, we gotta have a capital T. So if I go ahead and print the type is just a function that displays the type of a variable. And if I pass in my name, and I'll save this, and I'll edit my configuration to run this particular file. Right. So I will run this. So you notice this output, it shows class string. This is just a fancy way of saying that the data type of the variable you passed in is a string. So let's pass in the variable my age this time, and we can run this, and you see class int, so that is an integer. If we pass in my money, we can save that and run that, and you see class float. If we do the same thing for is cool, save that, run that, and we get class bool, or short for boolean. So there you have it. Those are the primitive data types in Python.